Okay, are you ready to dive into a world of mysteries and maybe uncover some hidden treasures along the way?
Always up for an adventure, especially if it involves two of my favorite things, the Goonies and Stranger
You
Things.
do. And you know what they say? Goonies never say die.
Speaking of things that never die, today we're digging into those juicy influences, those behind-the-scenes secrets that connect these two iconic stories. Like, did those spooky vibes from Stranger Things just materialize out of thin air? Or did the Duffer Brothers, the masterminds behind Stranger Things, find inspiration in some unexpected places?
And that's where things get really interesting because we're not just talking about surface level similarities here. We're going deep, unearthing those shared themes, those real life mysteries, and maybe even a conspiracy theory or two. Oh, I do love a good conspiracy theory. And speaking of which, let's talk about the Montauk Project. Now, for anyone who hasn't heard of this, it's a real doozy. We're talking government experiments, psychic children, maybe even time travel. It all supposedly went down at Camp Hero and the Montauk Air Force Station back in the 80s. Spooky stuff, right?
Spooky doesn't even begin to cover it. And you can't ignore the direct connection between the Montauk Project and Stranger Things. I mean, the show was originally titled Montauk for a reason. The Duffers were captivated by this idea of a sleepy town hiding a massive and slightly terrifying government secret.
Okay, now that's giving me chills.
Yeah.
Just imagine 11 using her powers on the beaches of Long Island. Although I guess Hawkins, Indiana does have a certain eerie charm to it.
Yeah.
So why had the switch? Did the psychic vibes just not feel right out east?
Well, as much as we might love to picture a Demogorgon wreaking havoc in the Hamptons, it boiled down to logistics. Filming in the dead of a Long Island winter. Let's just say, those snowstorms can be brutal. But even though the setting changed, that core inspiration, that seed of government paranoia and those kids with extraordinary abilities, it remained at the heart of Stranger Things.
It makes you wonder how much those real-life fears, those whispers about government secrets and the unknown, really seeped into both of these stories. Talk about tapping into the zeitgeist.
Absolutely. And speaking of things that defined the 80s, we can't forget about the one and only Steven Spielberg. I mean, this guy practically wrote the book on 80s adventure films, but did you know he was actually involved in the making of the Goonies?
Wait, seriously? As in he was actually on set directing scenes, Spielberg himself.
Oh yeah, Spielberg was hands-on with this one. He directed two of the most iconic scenes in the entire film, that heart-stopping pipe-banging sequence and the wonderfully whimsical wishing well scene.
Okay, mind officially blown. So we've got Spielberg directing scenes for The Goonies, and then years later, the Duffer Brothers pitching Stranger Things as, and I'm quoting here, Spielberg directing a Stephen King book. Talk about a match made in cinematic heaven.
It's like they took the best of both worlds, Spielberg's knack for heartwarming adventure and King's talent for tapping into those everyday fears, those things that go bump in the night, and they created something totally unique and unforgettable.
And speaking of unforgettable,
Yeah.
both The Goonies and Stranger Things knocked it out of the park when it came to casting. Those kids, those amazing young actors, they carried those stories on their shoulders.
Absolutely. And can we just take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of the casting process for Stranger Things? The Duffer Brothers auditioned over 900 boys and 300 girls. Can you imagine being a fly on the wall for that?
Honestly, I would have been a nervous wreck. And I'm just the one listening. But speaking of iconic child actors, The Goonies gave us some real gems, too. I mean, who could forget Data with his pinchers of peril and slick shoes?
And let's not forget about Mouth, the fast-talking Goonie who could charm his way out of any situation.
Right? Or Chunk with his truffle shuffle and his heart of gold. I mean, each one of those kids brought something so special to the group dynamic.
They were the ultimate band of misfits, and they reminded us that sometimes the greatest adventures happen when you least expect them. And when you're with your best friends, of course.
Couldn't have said it better myself. But it wasn't just the kids who made the Goonies so special. I mean, hello, One-Eyed Willie. Talk about a legendary pirate. And that treasure map. I've always been fascinated by how much detail went into making it look so authentically old.
You and me both. It's like it was plucked straight out of a history book. But I'm guessing it didn't get that way by just sitting in some dusty attic, right?
You read my mind. Get this, to achieve that aged, weathered look, the production designer used coffee and, wait for it, his own blood.
What?
Talk about dedication.
Wow, now that's commitment. And that attention to detail, that desire to create a world that feels both familiar and completely magical, it's something we see in Stranger Things, too.
Totally. Like 11 shaving her head. It's such a small detail, but it became so iconic, such a powerful symbol of her strength and resilience.
And it almost didn't happen. Millie Bobby Brown, who plays 11, was understandably hesitant about shaving her head. So to convince her, the Duffer Brothers showed her pictures of Charlize Theron in Mad Max Fury Road. They wanted her to see that shaving her head could be empowering, a way to transform herself.
And it totally worked. It became this defining feature for Eleven, this symbol of her stepping into her power.
It just goes to show that sometimes the smallest details can have the biggest impact. And speaking of details, remember those creepy bats in the caves with One-Eyed Willie's ship? Those weren't actually real bats.
Wait, are you serious? I always thought they were I mean, how else would they have gotten them to fly around like that back then?
Movie magic. They're incredibly realistic, though, right?
They totally freaked me out. I can still remember those scenes vividly.
Well, they achieved that with a combination of clever craftsmanship and some good old-fashioned ingenuity. They crafted those bats from bow ties, yes, bow ties, and paper mache. And to send them soaring through the air, they used air cannons.
Now, that's what I call creative problem solving. It makes you appreciate all the artistry and ingenuity that goes into creating these fantastical worlds, doesn't it? Speaking of which, remember that scene in the Goonies when they finally lay eyes on One-Eyed Willie's ship? The looks on their faces, that pure, unadulterated awe, it was incredible. Turns out, those reactions were totally genuine.
You're kidding. How did they manage to keep that a secret from those kids?
Richard Donner, the director, he was a master at this kind of thing. He kept the kids away from the soundstage where they built the ship, so their first glimpse was caught on camera. And you can totally tell. It's that raw, childlike wonder that you just can't fake.
That's brilliant. And it makes that scene even more special knowing it was a genuine moment of discovery for those young actors. And speaking of brilliant, we have to give the Duffer Brothers credit where credit is due. They weren't shy about showcasing their love for 80s cinema, and it's evident in every frame of Stranger Things. Like that opening title sequence with those bold red letters set against that black background, it's pure 80s nostalgia.
It's true. You know it's going to be good when you see that font. But I always wondered, did they just stumble upon that aesthetic, or was there a specific inspiration behind it?
They actually drew inspiration from a true legend in the world of title design, Richard Greenberg. He's the mastermind behind those unforgettable opening sequences for films like Aliens, Superman, and you guessed it, The Goonies.
Wow, it all comes full circle. It's like they took all those elements that resonated with them from their own childhoods, those things that stuck with them, and wove them into the fabric of Stranger Things. Speaking of nostalgic elements, those Christmas lights. It's such a simple idea, but so effective for Joyce to communicate with Will in the Upside Down. But was that always the plan?
It's hard to imagine Stranger Things without those twinkling lights, but the initial idea was actually a bit different. Originally, it was going to be the teenagers who used the lights to track the Demogorgon.
Really? Wow, that would change the entire dynamic of the story.
Yeah.
So what made them shift gears and give those lights such an emotional weight, such a powerful connection to Joyce's character?
One of the writers on the show suggested that Joyce could use the lights to communicate with Will. And it just clicked. It was like this light bulb moment, no pun intended. Suddenly, those everyday Christmas lights became so much more than just decorations. They were a lifeline, a symbol of a mother's unwavering love and her determination to reach her child no matter what dimension he was trapped in.
And you can't talk about that scene without mentioning Winona Ryder's incredible performance. The emotion in her voice, the way she embodies Joyce's fear and desperation, it's just so raw and powerful.
Absolutely. She brings such a depth of emotion to the role. It's no wonder those scenes became so iconic, so instantly memorable. And speaking of iconic performances, we have to talk about Millie Bobby Brown as 11. She completely embodies that character, the mystery, the power, the vulnerability.
And those eyes. You see so much going on behind them. It's like she's communicating volumes without saying a word.
Exactly. And did you know that her performance was actually inspired by E.T.?
Oh, now that's a connection I didn't see coming. 11 and E.T., both outsiders in strange new worlds trying to find their place.
Precisely. The Duffer Brothers encouraged Millie Bobby Brown to approach the role as if she were an alien, someone who was experiencing everything for the very first time.
That makes so much sense. It adds another layer to 11's vulnerability and makes you root for her even more. And speaking of rooting for the underdog, The Goonies really struck a chord with audiences.
It became an instant classic, and its legacy continues to grow stronger every year. And did you know that Astoria, Oregon, the charming town where they filmed the movie, actually celebrates Goonies Day every year on June 7th?
No way. A whole day dedicated to the Goonies.
Yeah.
That's amazing. What do? Dress up like pirates and search for One-Eyed Willie's treasure.
Pretty much. There are tours of the filming locations, movie quote-alongs, even attempts to break the record for the largest truffle shuffle.
I love it. It's a testament to the film's lasting impact and the passionate fan base it continues to inspire, even after all these years. And you know what? It makes perfect sense because The Goonies is more than just a movie. It's a celebration of friendship, adventure, and the power of believing in the impossible.
Beautifully said. And those themes of friendship and adventure are timeless, which is why both The Goonies and Stranger Things continue to resonate with audiences of all ages.
Absolutely. But, we've been talking a lot about the things that make The Goonies and Stranger Things similar, all those shared influences and inspirations. But I'm also curious about the things that set them apart, the ways in which they charted their own unique courses.
That's a great point. Because as much as they share a common DNA, so to speak, they're also distinct stories with their own unique flavors.
Exactly.
Because as much as they share a common DNA, so to speak, they're also distinct stories with their own unique flavors. Like, take the whole 80s high school experience. In Stranger Things, it's a huge part of the story, right? You've got the jocks, the cheerleaders, the awkward misfits navigating the social hierarchy. But in the Goonies, they kind of sidestep all that. It's like the kids are already outside of that whole social structure. They're the Goonies, remember? They've got their own rules, their own dynamic.
That's true. It's like they're already a self-contained unit, bound by their shared sense of adventure and their love for One-Eyed Willie. And speaking of those 80s tropes and characters, I read somewhere that Steve Harrington, the King of Hawkins High himself, wasn't always the lovable protector we know and adore.
You're right. It's almost impossible to imagine Stranger Things without Steve's heroic babysitting skills and that iconic hair. But in the original script, he was actually supposed to be the stereotypical 80s jock, more concerned with his reflection than saving the world.
Wow, that's a very different Steve Harrington than the one we know. What made the Duffer Brothers change course? Was it the fans? Did Joe Keery fight for his character?
It wasn't a case of rebellion or anything like that. It seems like they recognized the natural charisma and likability that Joe Keery, the actor who plays Steve, brought to the role. They decided to lean into that, rewriting Steve's arc so he evolved from a self-absorbed teenager into a brave, selfless hero.
And thank goodness they did. His transformation is one of the most satisfying parts of the entire show. He goes from being a typical high school antagonist to a true friend and protector, willing to risk his life for those he cares about.
It's a great example of how a character can evolve beyond those initial archetypes, adding depth and complexity to the story. And speaking of complex characters, did you know that Joyce Byers, played with such raw intensity by Winona Ryder, was directly inspired by two iconic films from the 70s?
Really? I always thought Winona Ryder brought something completely unique to the role. Which films were they going for? I'm racking my brain here.
The Duffer Brothers were aiming for that raw emotional intensity that Ellen Burstyn brought to Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore and Marsha Mason brought to Max Duggan Returns. They envisioned Joyce as this fierce, resilient single mother who would go to any lengths to protect her children, even if it meant battling supernatural forces.
That makes so much sense. They're both such powerful films, and those performances are unforgettable. It makes you wonder if those earlier films helped pave the way for strong, complex female characters like Joyce Byers.
Absolutely. Those films challenge the typical portrayal of women on screen, and you can see those echoes in Joyce's character. She's not a damsel in distress. She's a force to be reckoned with. And speaking of forces to be reckoned with, we can't forget about the incredible young cast of The Goonies. I mean, those kids face some seriously intense situations, especially filming in those dark, cramped tunnels.
I can't even imagine. They were so young. How did they manage to get those authentic reactions from the kids? Were they good at acting scared? Or did they use tricks back then like they do now?
A lot of credit goes to director Richard Donner. He was known for his ability to work with young actors, creating a fun, collaborative atmosphere on set. And apparently, he even let the kids improvise some of their lines.
No way. Now I need examples.
Yeah.
Did they actually use any of the improvised lines?
Remember that hilarious scene where Mouth, played by Corey Feldman, is listing off all the things he's going to buy with his share of One-Eyed Willie's treasure? He rattles off things like a new house for his mom, a team of scientists, and then throws in a lifetime supply of chocolate. That whole bit about the chocolate, totally improvised by Corey.
That's hilarious. It's those little unscripted moments that often become the most memorable. And speaking of memorable characters, we can't forget Data, the Goonies' resident inventor. Data, The Goonies resident inventor, he was like a walking, talking gadget factory. Those pinchers, the slick shoes, always one step ahead. But here's something I bet you didn't catch in one scene. Data mentions being scared of an octopus. Thing is, there's no octopus to be found anywhere in the entire film.
You're right. That's one detail that always has people wondering.
Yeah.
Turns out there was actually a scene where Data and Steph encounter an octopus after they escape from One-Eyed Willie's ship. They must have decided it was too much because it got left on the cutting room floor.
Wow, a deleted scene with a giant octopus. Now that's something I'd love to see. It makes you wonder how many other scenes or ideas were left behind. It's like those alternate universes we hear about in Stranger Things. A version of the story where Data battles a giant cephalopod.
It really makes you appreciate how much thought goes into making these stories. And speaking of Stranger Things, remember those mind-bending alternate dimensions? We talked about it earlier, but I'm still thinking about how the Duffer Brothers originally pictured the teenagers using Christmas lights to track down the Demogorgon.
Oh, that's right. It's hard to imagine those lights being used for anything other than Joyce talking to Will. What a stroke of genius that turned out to be.
It really was. They took ordinary Christmas lights and made them into a lifeline, a symbol of a mother's love and a beacon of hope in a terrifying situation. It shows how powerful collaboration can be.
Absolutely. Little decisions can make a huge difference. Speaking of which, did you hear about how the Duffer Brothers got that genuine reaction from Winona Ryder when Joyce meets the Demogorgon through the wall?
Oh, yeah. I love this story. They surprised her on set with a terrifying, life-size Demogorgon hidden behind the wall.
No way. That's brilliant and a little bit mean. But you have to admit, it's one of the most memorable scenes in the whole show.
Absolutely. It proves that sometimes the best performances are the ones you don't see coming. And remember that final scene on the beach in the Goonies with the inferno exploding? Turns out those reactions were real too.
You mean when the Coast Guard rescues them? I remember that. Their reaction seemed so real, full of adrenaline and relief.
They were. Director Richard Donner wanted to capture genuine reactions, so he kept the kids in the dark about most of the special effects. He nailed it.
Incredible. What a way to end the film. It's those unscripted, awe-inspiring moments that really stay with you. Both the Goonies and Stranger Things do that so well. They capture the power of imagination, friendship, and the thrill of the unknown.
So true. They remind us what it was like to be kids, when summers felt endless and anything felt possible. That feeling of adventure, that's what makes them so special.
Couldn't agree more. They remind us to hold on to that sense of wonder, to embrace the unknown, and to always be on the lookout for adventure. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and remember, Goonies never say die.